The Legions of Athena. Chapter 19. Maximus awoke startled and cold. Someone had just splashed freezing water onto his face to wake him. For a moment he expected it to be Hedger, but then everything came back to him like an unpleasant dream. He sat up to find an Athenian soldier standing beside him with an empty pail in his hand. "Wakey, wakey, you filthy Martian," he snarled. He looked around to find himself in a small, dark room. It had no windows and a single bulb hanging from the middle, which was the only source of light. It had no windows, but it had two exits, one a regular door and one the size of a garage door. The soldier began to walk away towards the ordinary one. "Wait, stop. I need to speak to Odysseus or Athena or someone," Max shouted. "Filth like you shouldn't be speaking at all," the soldier said as he walked out the door and shut it behind him. Maximus tried to go after him, but the door was locked shut. He looked around trying to pull himself together. At first he thought he was in prison, but then deduced that was not the case as he still had his sword with him. He then realized there was noise coming from behind the larger door. As he went closer to it, he realized it was the sounds of a large crowd chanting and cheering. Suddenly the larger door began to move upwards and the noise became louder than ever. The room opened to reveal a large circular field covered in sand. There were small boulders and 5-foot-high walls scattered around in it. Other large doors similar to this one were opening into the field, and out of each one, a single person stepped out. The deafening roar of the crowd around them got even more excited as the fighters entered the arena, and Maximus realized that the tournament was about to begin. Seeing that there was no other way, Maximus too stepped out into the arena's hot ground. But he knew this was no time for a tournament. He had to inform someone about what had happened. He looked up at the podium to find Athena and Helen of Troy seated there, along with Theseus standing right beside them. The portly commentator, Dalton, was also on stage with a mic. "Welcome one and all to the Owlets tournament," Dalton announced, and the crowd cheered and hooted loudly. Once the crowd settled down, Dalton began to speak again. "It is our proud tradition to hold one of our oldest tournaments of this city on the first day of the Panathenea festival. A tournament that showcases the strength and capabilities of the future leaders of the legions of Athena, the Tyros." More shouts from the crowd. "But let it not be said that there were none to challenge our fine Tyros, as they will be up against hardened gladiators in the arena. Even though our Tyros fight today only for the pride and honor of our goddess and our country, the challengers will be given immense riches if they are to succeed. Not that anyone has ever managed to best our Tyros in the history of our great nation." Another huge eruption of noise followed these words. Dalton cleared his throat and spoke again. "So as always, 16 contestants enter the ring, but only one will be victorious and win the glory of being remembered throughout history as the 27th Owlet champion. So without any further delay, let the games begin." Maximus couldn't believe the situation he was in. Daedalus was dead and he was stuck here in a tournament. He didn't care about this. He needed to let people know. But all around him, the other contestants were readying for battle. The 16 participants formed a rough circle within the arena. To his left, a guy 6 feet tall raised his massive battle axe. Right across him, a girl spun her lance and poised it ready to take on one of the Tyros. Among the 15 other contestants were a few familiar but unfriendly faces. There was Theo, dressed in the gray Athenian military uniform just like all the other Tyros, with his 2 electric batons ready. Next to him was the big guy Berg, holding a large mace made of wood and steel. The scrawny elf girl, Livian, was twirling her small knife-like sais in each hand. Then there was Elisha herself, armed with a shield and spear, gritting her teeth at everyone around her. Bang! Dalton had just shot a loud revolver into the air, signaling the start of the match. They were off. Every single one of the contestants charged at one another, with the exception of Max. As expected, the Tyros were acting as a unit, picking out the other contestants before turning on themselves, and the battle had already drawn blood. Soon, the middle of the arena was in mayhem. Maximus alone stood a bit further away from the roaring battle, barely able to hear his own thoughts due to the cheering of the crowds. He didn't care about the fight, but he had to get to Achilles or someone and let them know about what had happened to Daedalus. Wait, he thought to himself. Elisha was the leader of the Tyros. Surely if he could just let her know of the old inventor's death, she could call off the tournament. He spotted Elisha fighting against a bulky centaur, easily avoiding his club and the kicks from his front hooves. Max began to run towards her, and already 2 of the outsiders had fallen to the Tyros. But before he could reach her, he was greeted by a sudden jab from the side which caught Max on the thigh. It was Theo again, with his baton surging with electricity. The hit made Max stumble, but he didn't fall. He faced Theo, his sword ready, but he still didn't want to fight. "Heading straight for Elisha, are we? Stay and play with me for a while," Theo provoked, swinging his batons, but Max dodged his swipes. Maximus analyzed the situation. He felt he could take on Theo, but it would just be a waste of time. The more he waited, the farther Perseus got. He's probably already out of the city, Maximus thought to himself. He couldn't waste any time and let the trail run cold. "Listen, I don't want to," Max began, but Theo wasn't listening. He swung from the right, which Max blocked with the blade. But the second baton caught him in the ribs and threw him back. As he was thrown back, he felt the blow, but not the electricity. The Kevlar jacket he was wearing seemed to have countered it. More blows from Theo, and Max was in the defensive. He realized that he could take the hits from the batons as long as they landed on the jacket, but the moment the sticks touched his skin, it was game over. Theo kept up his assault, but Maximus didn't feel challenged. After his spars with Achilles, Theo just seemed too slow. And soon, Theo began to tire, but Max hadn't even broken a sweat. As Theo stepped back to catch his breath, Maximus decided to take a risk. He stepped forward to the tyro with his arms raised and he dropped his sword. He knew it was a stupid thing to do in an arena, but he felt it was the only way anyone would listen. "See, I'm unarmed. Now can we talk?" Maximus said to Theo. The tyro looked at Maximus, then to the sword on the ground, then back at Max and screamed, "No!" Theo lunged forward and stabbed the flat end of his baton onto Max's neck. Max felt searing pain as the electricity began coursing through him. He was now down on his knees, but he still didn't lose consciousness. "Please stop," he begged, but Theo didn't pay heed. Instead, he brought his second baton to the other side of Max's neck and just held the two sticks there, and even more volts began surging through Max's body. Maximus screamed in excruciating pain. Around him, the crowd cheered. He was on his knees and in tears, but the crowd cheered on. He felt his body weakening and his mind slipping away, but the crowd still rooted for his opponent. Then silence. Theo looked down on the Martian on his knees. His baton still fed electricity into his body, but his screams had stopped. Theo first assumed his victim had lost consciousness, but his eyes were still open, and Maximus was still on his knees. His body hadn't fell over yet. Then the Martian began to stand. A kind of dread began to creep into Theo as the Martian got to his feet, but he wasn't going to let that happen. The tyro began bashing his enemy over and over and over with the hopes of making him stay down. But it was of no use. Maximus was standing again, but his face seemed motionless and his eyes seemed dead. Theo had no idea how Maximus was still standing after that kind of a beating, but he was not about to get intimidated in front of the whole country by a Martian, so he charged again with his baton aimed straight for his skull. But Maximus stopped it. He didn't simply stop it. He grabbed the weapon, which was still surging with thousands of volts of electricity. Theo tried to pull back, but Maximus wouldn't let go. Then with one tug, Max pulled the baton from his hand and threw it aside. The worry of shame Theo had been feeling was replaced by a new feeling, fear. Theo raised his remaining baton to strike, but he was too slow. Maximus had just bought his fist with full force into Theo's raised armpit. Theo felt something crack as he staggered back from the blow. He had dropped his baton, and as he tried to reach out and seize it again, he realized he couldn't. His arm had just been dislocated from its socket, and he couldn't even move it, but the Martian wasn't done. He struck, and Theo tried to block his punches with his unharmed left arm, but he was still too slow. He felt the first punch connect with his lower left chest and break 3 of his ribs. The next punch to his stomach was so powerful that it filled his mouth with blood. The third one was to his jaw, which knocked loose one of his teeth. Theo had been pushed back by these whacks, and he could barely stand. With his last bit of strength, he stretched out his left hand and mumbled, "Please, let's talk." Maximus, however, responded to this with a right cross straight to his face, and his already broken nose was now crushed. Berg had just defeated one of the outsiders and turned to see Theo go down, at the hands of the Martian no less. "Damn idiot, told him not to break formation," Berg mumbled to himself. But in a way he was glad. Now he could take the Martian out personally. Berg straightened his helmet and raised his mace as he moved forward to face Maximus, but the Martian did not move. He didn't even glance up to acknowledge a 250-pound, mace-wielding warrior about to clobber him. Berg thought Max would start running as he drew closer, or at least take a defensive stance. Instead, he just stood there with his head hung, staring at the ground. "I'll end this with one strike," Berg thought as he brought his mace down hard on Maximus. But he missed. Berg couldn't believe it, except he had missed. He didn't know how, but Maximus had shifted himself just enough for the strike to miss him and hit the ground instead. Berg was about to attempt a second strike, but Max grabbed his helmet from the front. Berg didn't understand what his foe was doing, but he tried to shake his head to free it. But Max's grip was too tight, and then it grew tighter. So tight, in fact, that Berg's helmet began to get crushed under the pressure. And then, the metal helmet began to crush his skull. Maximus had crushed the helmet so hard that it would have to be sawed off to remove it. Berg, meanwhile, was on his knees now. He had dropped his mace, and was now using both his hands to loosen the clutch on his head. But Max's arms stayed strong. Then with one sudden swoop, he brought the enormous Athenian skull down to meet the ground, and the giant was out cold. Livian realized that the cheering of the crowd had begun to dull, and she had just noticed why. In the arena, only 4 of the tyros remained standing along with 3 of the outsiders, including the Martian. The Martian had just beaten Berg. All the contestants had stopped fighting as they witnessed Berg hit the ground. Livian couldn't believe it. Berg was the tyro of the 2nd Legion, the strongest fighter among them after Elisha, and seeing him overpowered so easily worried her. She and the other 2 remaining tyros looked to Elisha for guidance. "The 3 of you take him out," Elisha shouted. "I'll handle the others." She then went ahead to take on the remaining 2 contestants, leaving Livian and the others to deal with Maximus. Attack him all at once." Livian ordered the two remaining tyros, and they raised their swords and rushing towards the Martian. But Maximus got to them first. Within the blink of an eye, Maximus had his hands around the necks of the two tyros. Then, in a feat of inhuman strength, he lifted both of them off the ground and began choking them. The two tyros struggled trying to escape, but it was no use. Livian watched as the two unconscious bodies of her comrades fell on the sands. She too was filled with an unexpected sense of fear. Livian readied her psi blades. She was the tyro of the 3rd Legion that specialized in more tactical missions. She was more used to fighting in the shadows than out in the open like the arena, using her wits and heightened hearing to her advantage. Unfortunately, right now she had no choice. The entire reputation of the 8 legions hinged on the tyros defeating this Martian monster. She was not going down without a fight either. She charged straight at Maximus with her seis ready to strike. She calculated that getting too close to him would be a bad idea seeing what she just witnessed, so she decided to attack from a distance instead. She threw her two seis straight at Maximus, half expecting him to dodge, but he didn't, and her blades hit her mark. One had struck Max on the left shoulder and the other above his right knee. But Maximus didn't even flinch. He didn't even look at the direction of his attacker, even as he began to bleed. The shot to the shoulder didn't seem to have done much damage due to his Kevlar jacket, but the one in his leg had. The wound was bleeding profusely, and the sai was still stuck in it. Livian realized that this was the best time to strike, with him frozen in one position, so she leapt forward with a jump kick. That was her undoing as Maximus grabbed her leg in midair. She fell to the ground due to the loss in momentum, but Maximus still hadn't let go. He began to squeeze her leg, and the elf began to feel pain shoot through her body. Soon it was too much, and she began to scream, but Maximus still didn't let go. Instead, his grip kept tightening until finally the bone in her leg began to crack. Livian squirmed on the ground as the pain began unbearable, and with her last bit of strength she shouted to Elisha, "Help me!" before passing out from the pain. Elisha had just defeated her two opponents when she heard Livian scream from the other side of the arena. She had just seen the Martian crush her best friend's leg and watched helplessly as Livian passed out. Needless to say, she was beyond enraged. She readied her spear and moved forward to face the Martian as he finally let go of Livian's leg. She would have been impressed by the boy if she wasn't so enraged. She moved forth and pointed her spear at her adversary, but he in return ignored her. She realized that the Martian wouldn't make the first strike as she had hoped, but then Maximus began to move, but not towards her. Instead, he slowly paced towards where Theo lay, and Elisha saw why. Right next to where Theo's unconscious body was the Martian's sword, and he was heading to retrieve it. On any other occasion, Elisha would have let her enemy take the weapon. She found no honor or joy in facing an unarmed foe, but after witnessing what the Martian had done to her comrades, she was not in a very generous mood. As Maximus stretched his hand out to reach for his sword, Elisha thrust her spear between them. Then, with an upward swoop, her shaft met with the Martian's face. Maximus fell back at the strike. That got his attention, Elisha thought. But then the Martian stepped to take the sword again, ignoring her. This infuriated the tyro of the 1st Legion. She spun her spear and readied her stance, and at the tip of her spear, sparks began to appear as she charged her enemy weapon. Now the spearhead glowed a murky yellow like a setting sun, and her weapon was ready. "Pick up your damn sword then, Martian," she murmured. "I'll wait." That was her mistake. The moment Max held his sword, it erupted red. The blade began to glow crimson with wisps of energy around that made it appear to be composed of flames. He turned to face the tyro. Elisha wasn't expecting that, but it didn't matter. She had faced more seasoned foes with energy weapons before. The boy did not scare her. She charged with a forward thrust with her crackling spear, but the Martian did not move. He did not take a stance, but his blade remained aflame. As Elisha got closer, she could feel the heat emitted from it, and it made her sweat. But that didn't matter. The Martian was wide open, and she pushed forward with her strike. It happened so fast, and all Elisha saw was a red streak of light. She was blinded by it for a second. When she regained her sight, she was in for a shock. Initially, she thought her lance had missed, but that was not the case. Instead, she realized her spear was no longer a spear. Half of it was still in her arms, pointed at the Martian, but the top half of the spear now lay on the ground beside her, no longer alive with a yellow glow. Maximus had sliced right through her weapon. Elisha stood there frozen, and then she saw it, the look in his eyes. It was nothing like anything she had faced before, a look of pure killing intent. She couldn't move when he stepped towards her. She thought this was truly it, the moment she died, but Maximus did not raise his blade against her again. He did not even acknowledge her presence there anymore. Instead, he walked right past her, moving further away from the tyro and towards the main podium. Dalton the commentator fled from the stage on seeing his approach. Of the two women seated, Helen of Troy looked nervous, her eyes darting between Maximus and Athena, who was right beside her. But the goddess herself remained calm and was watching Maximus with a cold stare. Next to her, Theseus moved forward as if to come between Athena and the Martian if needed, revealing the summoning crystal on his left sleeve. As Maximus reached the front of the stage, the entire stadium had gone silent, and all eyes were on him. But his eyes were transfixed only on Athena. Maximus took his blade and stabbed it into the floor and let go, which stopped the blade from burning red. Then, looking straight at the goddess, he shouted, "Daedalus is dead." As the words escaped him, he fell to his knees, and tears filled his eyes. This has been a chapter from Book 2 of the new World Odyssey series, The Legions of Athena. Links to the books in the bio. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this chapter, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. See you in the next chapter.